Trace your finger along the map of the Caribbean in the year 1671 and feel the trade winds sliding across the Spanish Main like invisible currents of war. Smell the rot of seawater trapped deep inside oak hulls, where stagnant bilge ferments beneath cannon decks blackened by powder smoke and leaking pitch. Hear the sharp crack of snapping canvas stretched against gale force wind, while hemp rigging groans through dead ice slick with tar. Somewhere beyond the horizon, sails are moving through morning fog, low black silhouettes carrying nearly 2,000 armed men toward one of the richest cities on Earth. At their center stands Henry Morgan, a Welsh privateer turned pirate commander whose reputation became so terrifying that entire coastal settlements fled before his ships even dropped anchor. Morgan understood something most naval commanders of the 17th century did not. Gold could be stolen and replaced. Fortresses could be rebuilt. Fleets could be repaired in royal dockyards using fresh timber and new bronze artillery. But fear, once embedded into the imagination of an empire, spread faster than disease. Born around 1635 in Wales, Morgan arrived in the Caribbean during the violent expansion of Atlantic colonialism, an age when Spain transported nearly 180 tons of silver annually across oceans aboard treasure galleons, displacing more than 1,000 tons burthen. These floating fortresses carried towering stern castles rising over 35 feet above the waterline, their tumble-home hulls narrowing inward to complicate enemy boarding attempts, while supporting multiple gun decks packed with bronze demi-culverins forged from copper-rich alloys averaging 88% copper and 10% tin, with traces of zinc and arsenic impurities. A single demi-culverin weighed nearly 3,400 pounds and fired 9-pound iron round shot propelled by carefully measured black powder, composed of approximately 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. Once ignited through a touch hole by slow match or flint spark, the powder generated expanding gases reaching temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, forcing the projectile through the barrel at velocities capable of smashing through nearly 2 feet of oak planking and transforming shattered wood fibers into lethal splinters sharper than knives. Morgan studied these systems obsessively. He learned how Spanish trade routes functioned, how tides shifted through shallow reefs, how overloaded merchant hulls sat lower in the water when carrying bullion. Most importantly, he realized cities were softer targets than ships. Cities burned. Morgan's early years among the Brethren of the Coast hardened him into something colder than a conventional pirate. Buccaneers operating from Tortuga and Port Royal lived according to articles of agreement specifying compensation for battlefield injuries and exact percentages of captured loot. A sailor losing his right arm in combat could receive 600 pieces of 8. The loss of an eye might bring 100. These were not charitable rules, but industrial calculations designed to encourage aggression. Pirate vessels themselves required constant maintenance. Crews careened hulls onto isolated beaches, tilting ships sideways to scrape barnacles and shipworms from exposed planking using iron adzes and heated resin mixtures poured into damaged seams between futtocks and keel timbers. A clean hull could improve speed by nearly 2 knots, often the difference between interception and escape. Morgan mastered logistics, discipline, and terror simultaneously. In 1668, he attacked Portobello, one of Spain's most fortified Caribbean ports. Massive stone bastions armed with iron cannon overlooked the harbor, while coral reefs restricted naval access. Morgan bypassed the defenses entirely by landing several miles away beneath tropical darkness. Buccaneers marched through mangrove swamps waist-deep in black mud, carrying matchlock muskets protected by waxed leather powder flasks. Mosquitoes swarmed around them while humidity soaked clothing and rusted exposed steel. When Morgan's men finally stormed the city, they used scaling ladders under cannon fire so intense that iron shots smashed through bodies and walls alike. Witnesses later described shattered masonry sprayed with blood, while priests dragged wounded civilians into cathedrals already filling with smoke from burning warehouses. Yet Morgan did not merely loot Portobello. He staged terror deliberately. Prisoners were tortured for hidden silver using cords tightened around skulls with wooden windlasses until teeth cracked beneath pressure. Others were suspended by their wrists until shoulder joints tore apart. Morgan wanted refugees spreading stories faster than ships could sail. And they did. By 1669, Henry Morgan had evolved from privateer into psychological weapon. The attack on Maracaibo transformed his name into something whispered across the Caribbean with genuine panic. Lake Maracaibo connected to the sea through a narrow channel defended by Fort San Carlos, whose artillery batteries mounted bronze sakers firing 5-pound shot across tidal approaches lined with hidden sandbars. Spanish commanders considered the lagoon secure because larger warships struggled to maneuver within the confined waters. Morgan exploited exactly that assumption. His fleet consisted primarily of shallow draft vessels between 80 and 200 tons, rigged for speed rather than broadside warfare. Their hulls carried reinforced ribs scavenged from captured merchantmen, while swivel guns lined the rails for anti-personnel fire during boarding actions. The smell aboard these ships was unbearable. Wet hemp rope rotted beneath tropical humidity, while salted meat decayed inside storage barrels swarming with maggots. Powder monkeys slept beside cannon carriages coated in grease and soot. Rats gnawed through sailcloth beneath the lower deck, while seawater sloshed endlessly through bilges beneath the keelson. Yet Morgan's crews moved with terrifying efficiency. When they approached Fort San Carlos, Spanish artillery erupted instantly. Round shots skipped across the water before slamming into pirate hulls, shattering oak planks into clouds of jagged splinters traveling fast enough to sever arteries and limbs. Buccaneers responded by storming the fort directly. They carried grenades formed from hollow iron shells packed with powder and ceramic fragments ignited through fuse cords soaked in saltpeter. Once inside the walls, combat became hand-to-hand slaughter fought with boarding axes, pistols, knives, and cutlasses forged from high-carbon steel hardened through repeated quenching. Witnesses described powder smoke hanging so thick inside corridors that men fought almost blind while wounded soldiers drowned in flooded gun emplacements, stained black with blood and seawater. Maracaibo itself collapsed into chaos. Church bells rang wildly as civilians fled carrying silver plate, crucifixes, sacks of coin, and terrified children through streets paved with uneven stone slick from tropical rain. Morgan established systematic interrogation centers inside merchant warehouses where prisoners endured brutal torture designed to reveal hidden valuables. Buccaneers twisted cords around foreheads until eyes bulged from pressure. Fingernails were ripped away with heated pincers. Some captives were lowered slowly over open flames while their families watched helplessly nearby. Yet the true horror arrived after the looting. Morgan's men carried tinder cords, resin-soaked oakum, and tar bundles specifically intended for arson. Caribbean colonial cities were catastrophically flammable. Cedar beams dried beneath equatorial heat ignited rapidly once sparks entered roof interiors. Tar storage barrels exploded beneath rising temperatures. Palm-thatched structures burned like paper soaked in oil. Wind rushing through narrow alleys acted like a furnace bellows, feeding oxygen into spreading firestorms. Within hours, entire districts of Maracaibo glowed orange against the night sky. Smoke rolled across the lagoon carrying the smell of burning sugar, scorched leather, sulfur, and human flesh. Roof tiles shattered from thermal stress while church bells softened and warped beneath temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Survivors later described hearing trapped civilians screaming behind collapsed beams while embers drifted through the streets like volcanic ash. Morgan wanted precisely this outcome. He understood terror multiplied military power. Nearby settlements surrendered more quickly after hearing what happened at Maracaibo. Entire coastal populations fled inland during rumors of pirate sails appearing offshore. Yet Morgan still sought a greater target. In late 1670, despite the recent Treaty of Madrid officially ending hostilities between England and Spain, Morgan assembled one of the largest pirate fleets in Atlantic history. Over 35 ships, nearly 2,000 men, hundreds of cannon, surgeons carrying amputation saws and cauterization irons, blacksmiths transporting spare flints, nails, grappling hooks, and musket parts. Powder stores totaling nearly 90 tons protected inside wax-sealed barrels. This was no ordinary raid. It resembled a private invasion army, and its target was Panama City. Part 3. Picture the jungles of Panama in January 1671. Rain hammers broad banana leaves while insects swarm so thick above stagnant pools they resemble drifting smoke. Mud swallows boots to the ankle. Humidity saturates gunpowder unless stored inside waxed leather pouches. Morgan's army marched through this nightmare for nearly 50 miles after capturing Fort San Lorenzo at the mouth of the Chagres River. Panama City represented the economic heart of the Spanish Pacific. Silver mined in Peru traveled north aboard galleons before crossing the isthmus by mule caravan toward Caribbean ports. Warehouses overflowed with emeralds, silk, church gold, spices, cacao, and porcelain imported from Asia. The city itself housed approximately 7,000 residents protected by militia forces, cavalry, artillery, and surrounding terrain considered naturally defensive. Spanish commanders believed jungle, disease, and starvation would destroy Morgan long before battle began. They underestimated the endurance of Caribbean buccaneers hardened through years of deprivation. Food vanished quickly during the march. Pirates boiled leather into broth. Some hunted monkeys and wild birds for meat. Dysentery spread through the ranks, producing fevers, cramps, and bloody diarrhea, severe enough to kill weakened men beside the trail. Yet Morgan forced the army forward relentlessly. On January 28th, his exhausted force finally emerged onto plains outside Panama City. Spanish defenders assembled cavalry supported by artillery batteries firing iron shot across open grassland. Cannon roared beneath clouds of sulfur smoke, while round shot plowed through pirate formations, tearing apart flesh, bone, and soil simultaneously. Horses screamed as musket balls shattered legs beneath armored riders. Morgan's marksmen responded with disciplined fire, using long-barreled French fusils capable of superior accuracy compared to standard muskets. Buccaneers who once hunted wild cattle across Hispaniola now targeted Spanish officers and cavalry mounts with deadly precision. One of the strangest tactics in colonial warfare followed soon after. Spanish defenders attempted a cattle stampede, driving panicked bulls toward pirate lines in hopes of collapsing formations. Morgan's men simply shot the animals. Gunpowder smoke drifted across the battlefield, carrying the bitter metallic smell of blood, while wounded cattle collapsed into mud beside dead soldiers. Within hours, Spanish resistance broke completely. Morgan entered Panama City victorious. What happened next remains among the most controversial episodes in pirate history. Fires erupted almost simultaneously across multiple districts soon after the city fell. English accounts later blamed retreating Spanish defenders for accidentally igniting powder stores. Spanish survivors accused Morgan of deliberate arson. The evidence suggests coordination impossible to ignore. Tarred warehouses ignited rapidly. Powder magazines exploded with catastrophic timing. Wind carried embers between tightly packed buildings constructed largely from timber frameworks hidden beneath plaster facades. Panama transformed into a furnace. Temperatures climbed high enough to melt church bells and warp iron hardware. Roof beams collapsed through floors already weakened by fire, while trapped civilians suffocated beneath smoke thick with ash and burning resin. Witnesses described entire streets glowing red beneath drifting embers while soldiers looted silver plate from monasteries collapsing around them. Morgan enforced brutal discipline during the destruction. Unauthorized looters were whipped publicly or executed. He wanted wealth extracted systematically before flames consumed the city entirely. Prisoners endured torture intended to reveal hidden valuables buried beneath courtyards and church crypts. Some captives had fingers crushed beneath musket hammers. Others were suspended by ropes tied behind their backs until joints dislocated audibly. Panama burned for days. Contemporary estimates suggest more than 8,000 structures were destroyed. Financial losses reached millions of pieces of eight. But Morgan's true achievement was psychological. The Spanish Empire suddenly realized no colonial city was truly secure. The destruction of Panama sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. Refugees carried stories of collapsing cathedrals, burning warehouses, and streets clogged with corpses through every colonial trade route from Cartagena to Havana. Governors diverted enormous funds toward new fortifications, while engineers redesigned bastions using angular trace Italienne geometry inspired by European siege warfare. Walls thickened, powder magazines were buried deeper underground, artillery batteries expanded, insurance costs for merchant shipping increased sharply as investors realized even the wealthiest ports could vanish beneath pirate assault. Morgan had transformed terror into strategy. He understood that when fear spread faster than fleets, victory became self-sustaining. Yet the irony of his career soon emerged. Spain demanded punishment for the destruction of Panama because England and Spain were technically at peace under the Treaty of Madrid. Governor Thomas Modiford, who issued Morgan commissions through ambiguous letters of marque, was arrested and transported to England. Morgan himself was summoned as well, but instead of execution, he found celebrity. London society admired him as the man who humiliated Spain. Publishers sold sensational accounts describing flaming cities and oceans choked with wreckage. Aristocrats crowded taverns hoping to glimpse the infamous privateer. England officially condemned piracy while quietly benefiting from weakened Spanish dominance in the Caribbean. Morgan understood the hypocrisy perfectly. He abandoned rough pirate clothing for tailored coats and cultivated wealthy patrons tied directly to colonial commerce. In 1674, King Charles II knighted him. Sir Henry Morgan, destroyer of Panama, became Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The transformation bordered on absurdity. The man who terrorized the Caribbean now carried responsibility for suppressing piracy itself. Yet violence remained inseparable from the world he inhabited. Port Royal during Morgan's later years was among the most dangerous cities on Earth. Taverns, brothels, gambling dens, slave markets, and warehouses crowded unstable sandbars vulnerable to earthquakes and hurricanes. Streets smelled of sewage, rum, sweat, and decaying fish, while merchant ships unloaded sugar hogsheads weighing over 1,000 pounds each. Sugar production itself formed part of the same imperial system Morgan once attacked. On plantations, enslaved laborers cut cane beneath unbearable tropical heat before feeding stalks into crushing mills powered by oxen walking endless circles through mud. Cane juice boiled inside copper kettles over roaring furnaces until crystallized into export sugar. Workers caught in machinery could be dragged between rollers and crushed before the equipment stopped turning. Morgan profited enormously from this economy. He purchased estates, accumulated enslaved workers, and drank heavily while serving colonial administration. Yet across the Spanish world, his name remained synonymous with fire. Coastal watchtowers maintained constant lookout for suspicious sails decades after his final campaign. Entire settlements evacuated during false alarms triggered by distant ships on the horizon. Parents frightened children with stories about Morgan appearing from sea mist to burn towns into ash. Some tales exaggerated his cruelty undoubtedly, but the consistency of survivor accounts remains chilling. Burned churches, tortured captives, public executions staged beside harbor walls. Morgan recognized that spectacle amplified terror. When survivors escaped a destroyed city carrying vivid memories of flames and screams, they became unwilling messengers spreading panic more effectively than any proclamation. This was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. By the 1680s, Morgan's body deteriorated from alcoholism, tropical disease, and age. Witnesses described swollen limbs, jaundiced skin, and violent coughing fits. The pirate who once marched through Panamanian jungles now struggled to climb stairs without assistance. But his legend only grew stronger. Sailors repeated stories of Panama beside Lantern Light in Nassau, Bristol, Tortuga and Charleston. Some swore Morgan laughed while entire districts burned behind him. Others claimed he watched silently from horseback as church towers collapsed through fire. Truth and mythology fused together until separating them became nearly impossible. To understand why Henry Morgan burned cities, it is necessary to understand the brutal mechanics of 17th century empire. Spain's colonial economy depended upon concentration. Silver concentrated inside ports, treasure concentrated inside counting houses, bureaucracy concentrated inside fortified capitals connected by predictable maritime routes. Morgan recognized this structure as weakness. Destroying a city caused consequences extending far beyond immediate casualties. When Panama burned, Peru lost access to its primary Pacific transfer hub. Merchant caravans stalled. Credit systems collapsed temporarily. Insurance costs surged in European financial markets. Convoys required heavier naval escorts, increasing military expenditure across the empire. Morgan weaponized interconnected systems long before modern strategists described such concepts formally. His raids targeted warehouses, shipyards, granaries, powder magazines, and mule depots, because he understood logistics mattered more than battlefield glory. During the sack of Panama, buccaneers deliberately destroyed millstones, slaughtered draft animals, and contaminated wells. Starvation and economic paralysis became extensions of warfare. Even architecture itself worked in Morgan's favor. Colonial cities relied heavily on cedar and mahogany framing hidden beneath plaster surfaces. Open hearths existed inside nearly every structure. Candles illuminated storage buildings packed with cotton, hemp, oil, and gunpowder. Urban firefighting methods remained primitive, dependent upon bucket brigades incapable of controlling large infernos once strong wind accelerated flame spread. Morgan exploited these vulnerabilities ruthlessly. Sometimes he barely needed combat at all. The mere threat of fire forced surrender before cannons opened fire. Buccaneers themselves represented a unique military culture shaped by constant violence. Many originated as hunters on Hispaniola who specialized in smoking meat over wooden boucans, giving rise to the term buccaneer. Years spent hunting wild cattle trained them into exceptional marksmen. Long-barreled muskets stabilized against forked rests allowed aimed shots at distances exceeding 100 yards, remarkable accuracy for the era. Morgan integrated these hunters into coordinated assault forces, emphasizing mobility and precision over rigid European drill formations. During sieges, his men used fascines, scaling ladders, and captured artillery with surprising professionalism. This was not random drunken chaos. It was adaptive, irregular warfare refined through years of colonial conflict. Morgan's ships reflected the same pragmatism. Hulls were modified constantly according to mission requirements. Additional swivel guns mounted along the rails increased anti-personnel fire during boarding actions. Spare rigging, anchors, and sailcloth were scavenged from captured vessels before the hulls were burned. Navigation relied upon experienced pilots familiar with reefs, currents, and seasonal wind shifts throughout the Caribbean basin. Spanish captains commanding heavier warships often avoided shallow coastal waters where Morgan maneuvered aggressively. Fire remained his greatest instrument because 17th century urban centers were essentially giant fuel depots waiting for ignition. Powder stores exploded beneath rising temperatures. Tar boiled from roofing materials. Heated air created convection currents drawing flames through streets with terrifying speed. Survivors trapped inside buildings often died not from burns, but from smoke inhalation as oxygen vanished beneath rolling black clouds. Morgan understood every detail intuitively. He realized terror multiplied faster than flame itself. One burning city frightened 10 others into submission. That was the message he carried across the Caribbean. Resistance meant annihilation. Final Henry Morgan died on August 25, 1688. Wealthy enough to receive a state funeral in Jamaica, attended by colonial officials, merchants, soldiers, and plantation elites enriched through Caribbean trade. Cannons thundered from anchored ships while church bells echoed across Port Royal Harbor. His coffin descended into the earth with full honors, despite the fact that only years earlier, Spain considered him one of the most dangerous men alive. Yet death did not end Morgan's story. On June 7, 1692, catastrophe struck Port Royal itself. A massive earthquake shattered the city during the late morning hours. The sandy foundations beneath streets and warehouses liquefied instantly beneath seismic shock, behaving like water under the weight of buildings and artillery batteries. Entire districts collapsed into the harbor. Taverns slid beneath black waves carrying rum barrels, cannon, and screaming civilians into the sea. Witnesses described the ground rippling like ocean swells, while fissures opened beneath crowded streets. Brick walls exploded outward. Church towers toppled. Thousands drowned within minutes. Cemeteries vanished beneath the harbor, including Morgan's grave. The pirate who once burned cities disappeared beneath the Caribbean he had terrorized for decades. There is something brutally fitting about that ending. No preserved tomb survived. No monument remained untouched. Only stories endured. And those stories carried a warning larger than piracy itself. Henry Morgan exposed the fragility of empire. Spain ruled territories stretching across continents with treasure fleets, silver mines, armies, and cathedrals. Yet one determined commander operating from humid Caribbean ports demonstrated how quickly fear could unravel confidence. Morgan succeeded not because he commanded overwhelming military strength, but because he attacked morale, logistics, and perception simultaneously. Fire became his language. Every burning warehouse, every collapsing church roof, every exploding powder magazine communicated vulnerability. Imagine standing beside the ruins after one of his raids finally ended. Ash drifts through the air while seawater reflects orange flame beneath smoke-darkened skies. Burned cannon carriages lie overturned beside shattered oak beams, split apart by iron round shot. Survivors wander through rubble carrying soot-covered children while the smell of sulfur, charred cedar, and human flesh clings to the humid wind. Offshore, pirate ships ride quietly at anchor with lanterns swaying above black water. Sailors scrape blood from deck planks using pumice stone while rigging creaks softly in the night. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another colonial city waits in terror, listening for rumors, watching the sea, wondering if Morgan's sails will appear next. That was always his true weapon. Not bronze cannon, not flintlock pistols, not boarding axes or grenades, fear itself. And once fear spread across the Caribbean, the fires no longer needed Henry Morgan to keep burning.